Today I'm using watercolor paints, painting on fabric and creating a mix of colors inspired by the Aurora Borealis, the northern lights. Then I'm adding layer upon layer of slow stitching, creating even more color and loads of texture. Join me start to finish as I add paint to my fabric, choose coordinating floss colors, and add layers of straight stitches and blanket stitch half circles to create another touchable panel for my ongoing scroll project. I'm glad you're here. Let's get started. I'm going to be using two different pans of watercolor. This is the first one from Prima. It has some bright colors in it. And this is the other one by Koi, and it has a few more colors, and they're more traditional and muted colors. And I'll be dipping into both today. The other thing I'm going to be using are brushes. You can use these water brushes where there's water inside of the brush and you squeeze while you're working and it brings out some water. And you can also use regular paint brushes, and that's what I'm going to be using today. I'm also going to be using two different pots of water, one to clean my brush and one to wet my brush. I'm going to put down some fabric to be underneath the fabric I'm painting on. This is cotton muslin, and that's going to absorb any water or paint that goes through my piece of fabric. The fabric I'm going to be using is a thin cotton. This is cotton voile. You could also use any other fabric, recycled or new. Your fabric can be washed or not washed, whatever you prefer. The piece of fabric I'm working with is 3 inches wide and 10 inches long. So about 7.5 centimeters by about 25 centimeters. I'm going to place that on top of my backing fabric, the muslin. And the first thing I'm going to do is wet my fabric. I've taken a paintbrush that's got a flat end on it, dipping it in the water, and I'm spreading that around on my fabric. And that's going to make any paint that I add flow and absorb into the fabric easier. I'm going to use this rounded brush for my painting today, but you could use any brush that you prefer. The first color I'm going to be using is the bright pink out of this small set. I'm going to wet my brush and load up some of that pink and start spreading it around in this top area. You can build color here as you work to make it darker. I'm going to switch now and add in some purple and some red from this same set. I'm going to let that purple wick in to that pink. I'm going to bring some red in there. Just see what happens. Let it all flow and absorb and see what the colors look like. I'm going to also dip back into my pink, and I'm going to add some of that pink as well. So it's really 3 colors here that I'm mixing. Thing to keep in mind with watercolors is that they always dry lighter than they appear. So I'm going to keep adding little drops of color in these pink and purple shades. Now I'm going to switch to light green that's in that same set. This is a beautiful yellow green. I'm going to drop that in the other areas where there isn't any paint. And I don't have a plan here. What you could do is if you had a picture you were working from of a landscape, for example, you could try to drop in some colors using that photo as a reference. Here, I'm going for a more abstract look. Now I'm switching to an olive green in the other set. That changes up that color a little bit. Now I'm dipping into this yellow ochre color. It's a beautiful golden shade. It's a really nice one to mix in with different shades of green. You can see that corner I'm working on there. That spot must have not gotten wet when I spread water at the beginning, and you can see the difference that that makes. You can see that there's a line there. And I'm wanting my colors to really flow together, which is the effect you get if you wet your fabric at the beginning. So I'm going back and forth with this olive green and this ochre. No plan and no idea in terms of what I want it to look like. Just watching the colors wick in. Now I'm going to switch to this dark green blue shade. So the green is going to work really well with the green that's already there, and the blue part in that green blue is going to bring in another shade that's not there yet. And there's just a hint of blue in this dark green. So I'm spreading that around and concentrating this dark color along the bottom. And then I want to add it to the edges of the fabric. So I'm moving it to the top as well and letting it soak in. And always keeping in mind that these colors are going to fade quite a bit when this fabric dries. None of these colors are going to be as intense as they look right now. And now I'm going to go back to my rounded shape at the top, and I'm going to drop in some more purple. The other colors are looking quite intense, so I want to match that intensity by adding some of that purple. And this fabric is still very wet, so everything's soaking in and spreading around. I'm dipping into the pink again and the reds. I'm adding more of those shades until I'm happy with the intensity of these colors. Now might be a time where you look at your piece of fabric and you think that it's good and it's time to stop. I still feel like I want to play here, so I'm going to add some lines. I'm going to go back to that dark blue-green color and I'm going to start adding it around my circle, and I'm really enjoying that color, so I decide that I want to add a diagonal line across the bottom. And I get even more bold and decide that I'm going to add some lines over top of my pink and purple area. And this is because I'm still feeling inspired by seeing those northern lights and the way that those colors were mixing together. So I put those lines all across my rounded shape at the top. And then I add some more of that blue-green color along the top. I don't want to lose those yellow ochre shades with all of this green blue that I'm adding. So I'm going to come back and drop color onto this wet surface. So I've loaded up color and I'm just touching some spots and letting that golden color soak into the fabric. And then I do the same thing with my pinks and my purples. Big drops of wet color right on top of everything. I'm going to stop here and I'm going to let this fabric dry. It's very, very wet, you can see. So I'm going to leave it on this muslin that I've painted on and I'm going to let it dry. So here is my fabric dry. You can see how much lighter it is. The colors are very faded. The blue-green has stayed quite intense, but everything else is looking quite faded. This is fine. I could start stitching on this project now. And I want to show that you can come back in a second time and you can add more color. And before, when I was working, I had wet my fabric and then added the paint. This time I'm going to work right on this dry fabric. I'm going to come in with the colors I've already used. I'm going to go over top. So this is a wet on dry technique. It's going to change the way that the color spreads. It's not going to flow as much as it did. It's going to stay in place. So the lines are going to be slightly harder unless I wet my brush and come in and try and blend the colors. Knowing again that when it dries, it's going to be much lighter. I move that color around. I let some of that purple absorb. I bring in some yellow, just the same colors that I used before, coming in and going over top of the areas that I'd already painted to see if I can make some of those colors a little more vibrant. So now I'm going to let this dry again like I did before. Everything's wet. I'm going to leave it on this backing muslin fabric and let it dry. So here it is. The colors are slightly more intense than before. I like the way that that's looking. This isn't something that I'm going to wash, so I'm not going to add any other kind of fabric medium or treatment to it. And when I feel it, it's still very soft. It's going to be easy to stitch through. So adding this watercolor has not changed the hand of the fabric, the feel of the fabric. It hasn't stiffened it. Adding a fabric medium would also make it more permanent. So that's an option. I'm going to leave it as is. I'm going to iron it, and then I'm going to be ready to stitch on this piece. I've cut a piece of batting that's slightly smaller on all sides than my piece of fabric. I'm using felt here. You could use another piece of fabric. You could use quilt batting, anything that feels soft to you and feels like it will be easy to stitch through. So I've laid that piece on the back of my fabric, and now I'm going to choose some floss colors for stitching. I'm going to choose a few shades in these blue-green colors and a few shades of this pink and purple, some lighter and some darker. And I may add some more as I go along, particularly in the yellows and greens, but this is a good place to start. This is an abstract stitching, so I have no plan about what I want it to look like. Just want to start slow stitching. And I want to use really simple stitches and simple lines and just enhance the colors that I've made with this watercolor. So I'm going to start with 2 strands of this pink. And I am just moving the needle in and out, making these running stitches. And I'm following the lines that I've made with the painting. No plan, except that I know that I want to add lots and lots of stitch to this. I want this to be really heavily stitched. I'm just going to have fun with the different colors. So here are my first few lines of stitching. I already like the texture and the lines that I'm getting there. So my plan is to continue to fill out these areas. I'm going to move back and forth between the shades. There's very slight variation in these shades of this pinky purple. So that's going to let me play with color and make some areas darker and make some areas lighter. And maybe I can play with shadows and add a bit of depth that way. So I'm continuing to fill out this area. I'm going over top of those blue-green lines and seeing how I like the look of that contrast. This is going to be a fun process of going back and forth, reacting to what I see, picking out colors, and stitching lines. Now bringing in this blue-green color, I'm going to add that. I'm going to start stitching right underneath this round shape. I have lots of options about how I want the orientation of all the stitches to go, and at this point, I'm keeping a lot of these stitches vertical. I can start to angle them. I can make horizontal stitches. Really, the possibilities are endless here. I'm just going to do what feels right in the moment and enjoy the process of stitching. And this process is going to be different for every piece that's painted. Some pieces are going to be maybe based from real life or a photograph, and that's going to inform how you stitch. In this case, this is really abstract. This is really just about colors and shapes. So really anything goes here. I'm taking that blue-green color and I'm bringing it up and stitching over those lines that I had painted over top of this pinky purple shape. And that's going to change the way that they look. This dark green color playing off against this fuchsia shade is starting to add some of that depth that I'm looking for. You can see I've extended out this blue-green diagonally up on the right-hand side. And all the stitching here has added so much texture. I still don't have a plan or know where I'm going with this, and I'm not worried about it. I'm just enjoying this. So I'm going to continue. I'm going to move these colors all around the piece. So at this point, I've used 3 different shades of this pinky purple and 2 shades of the blue-green, and I'm going to bring in some even lighter shades, moving into these pale lavenders. I'm also going to bring in some lighter green. So here I've stitched in lighter green, moved that up. I'm moving back and forth between the green shades, the fuchsia shades, and even adding some yellow. I'm adding some of this pale lavender right on the edge, bridging the gap where these colors are changing from the pinks to the yellows. So at this point, I have completely covered this piece in stitch. I've got greens and yellows. I've even put some French knots over on the left-hand side. So this is a time, looking at this piece, I could say this is complete. It's got a lot of intense stitching. So how do you know when it's finished? Well, when I look at this piece, I still have some ideas about colors and shading and more I want to do. So I'm going to keep going. You can see that I haven't stitched on the edges of this piece. And if you remember, my piece of batting, the felt, is smaller on all sides. So that's left these loose edges, which I quite like. So there are a number of options about what to do with these edges. They could be folded under and stitched down. They could be stitched on the back so you couldn't see the stitches. And you could, of course, use a blanket stitch, which is something I do quite a bit. The other thing you could do is fray this fabric even more. I think I'd like to create some kind of border around this piece. So I'm going to take my dark blue-green color and I'm going to stitch all along the top to create a line. So I've stitched one row across and I'm starting to stitch a second row. This is going to add a nice visual border. So here is this nice line of this dark green across the top. And this piece is really looking finished, but I still have some ideas about what I want to do. So I'm going to continue. I'm going to pull a few threads out of the top and let that top fray a bit more and see how I feel about that. So the idea that I've come up with is to add more of these pink colors into the piece in other areas. So what I've decided to do is add some blanket stitch half circles. This creates a beautiful mosaic, or in this case, because it's a half circle, even a spider web type of effect. I've done this before in some of my other videos, which I will link below, where you can see where I really go in depth about this mosaic stitch and the possibilities with it. So I have one of the darker purpley fuchsia colors on my needle, and I'm going to start and make a small rounded shape, and that's going to be the base that I begin this blanket stitch on. So there's my shape, and now I'm going to come up with my needle, hold my thread to the left, take a stitch through the base of that shape, and come up with my thread on the left. I'm coming through and forming a loop. And then I move a little ways to the right and I do the same thing again. I come up from the base. Because I'm holding my thread to the left, it makes a loop. And I can continue around this half circle shape, working my way all the way to the other side. So there is my first round of blanket stitch in this half circle shape. I could turn and go back in the other direction, or I could stop and start again on the left, always working to the right. Whatever's most comfortable for you. If you work in the other direction, you would just do everything the opposite way. So I'm going to continue adding a few rows, making this half circle shape larger and larger. So there's my second row, and I'm going to continue and add more. So here's my little dome. I'm going to continue. I'm going to make these rows shorter as I go to the right, and I'm going to make them taller on the left, and that's going to change the shape of this half circle. So that central part where I started is going to end up being more offset. So you can see those taller rows on the left, and then they get shorter on the right. You can even stop your blanket stitching before you get all the way to the other side by getting shorter and shorter and then just ending like I'm doing here. So here is this shape completed. I think I like the size of it at this point, so I'm going to stop. Now I'm coming in with a slightly darker color, and I'm going to outline the outside of this shape. That's going to help to make it stand out more. And I'm going to use the back stitch to do that. So it's going to be a nice solid line. You could start at either end to do this, using the back stitch where you go past your previous stitch, come out, and then you go back to where your previous stitch came out. And that way you make a solid line. So there's my shape outlined with the darker color. And now I want to make another one. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to make this shape smaller than the other one. Same process though. Starting by stitching a solid round shape and then working my blanket stitch off of there. Here's my second half circle. I'm going to keep that smaller than my previous one. And I think I want to add one more very small one. So I've added one along the bottom, and also I added some right along the top on the left there. I just made half circle shapes. I didn't do the blanket stitch. So I've created an echo almost on the top of what I've done on the bottom. Now I'm thinking about the edges, and I've decided to do a blanket stitch, and I've started over here on the right, started up at the corner. I've used the same color that I created the domes out of, and I'm folding my fabric under. I'm going to work all the way across the bottom. I'm liking the way that blanket stitch looks. I don't think I'm going to go across the top. I'm going to leave that. And what I'm going to do is come in with my needle, and I'm going to fray that top piece of fabric even more. Because of all the stitching, there's been gathering of that fabric, and it's almost going to look like a ruffle along the top. And I like that idea. So I'm going to use my needle to pull out some of those threads, and then I'm going to snip them off. So I looked at my piece again, and I decided I wanted to add some more stitch, another layer on top of this heavy stitching to add some shadows. So I've done that. I've added more French knots to both the left and the right. The tiniest half circle on the bottom, I've added one layer of blanket stitch. And then I've come in with that dark blue-green and stitched even more and added more blanket stitch to the border to add some contrast. I'm really liking the way that this border looks with that blanket stitch along the bottom. I've decided I'm going to extend that up onto the left side. So there that is. I've used that dark blue-green color. And now I have the blanket stitch on 3 sides and my ruffle at the top. And now I feel like this piece is complete. So now I want to add a backing. And I have this piece of batik fabric that was gifted to me, and I feel like the colors go so well with this stitched piece. So I'm going to put this on the back. I've cut a piece slightly larger on all sides, and then I folded down the 2 short sides and one of the long sides. So it fits perfectly on the back, and I've left the top raw so that it matches that ruffle at the top. So I'm going to stitch this on all 4 sides, but on the top, I'm going to leave it open. I've chosen a coordinating floss that I've used on the front, and it matches well with this backing piece. And I'm using 2 strands, and I'm going to stitch it on. I'm going to use a running stitch on the 2 short sides, and on the long side, I'm going to use the blanket stitch. I'm going to use some clips to keep it from shifting around as I stitch. So I've started stitching on this 1 short side. I'm not worried about stitching through to the front. If those stitches show, they're going to match what's already stitched in the background. So I'm using a running stitch here on the sides. And then when I get to the long bottom piece, I'm going to switch and use a blanket stitch. So I've begun my blanket stitch here. I'm about 1/3 of the way across, and I'm going to continue. I'm going to remove my clips as I go, and when I get to the 3rd side, I'm going to do a running stitch, and then along the top, I'm going to do a running stitch as well, leaving the top part free to match the ruffle. So here it is stitched. The blanket stitching is there, the straight running stitch on the top. So the top is actually open. And this piece eventually is going to be joined to my other scroll pieces. And in the meantime, I'm going to take this wooden clothespin and I'm going to wrap the piece around the clothespin. I like the way that looks. I like the way you can see the blanket stitching on the bottom and the raw ruffle on the top. I found a piece of purple ribbon that's a very close match to the stitching. So this is going to be perfect to wrap around this piece. I'm not sewing it on or tying it on at this point because I plan to add to it later. So I'm going to just tuck that piece of ribbon in, and it's going to hold everything together. So here it is unwound. Loads and loads of texture and color, the beautiful backing, inspired by the colors of the Aurora Borealis, It's a beautiful abstract celebration of color. Storing it with this ribbon and wooden clothespin, it's ready to be added to and beautiful on its own. I hope this has inspired you to get out a set of watercolor paints and play with the possibilities of painting on fabric and creating a stitched piece that you love. Thank you so much for joining me. Until next time, happy stitching.